For 2 to 3% of adolescents, a biological clock simply fails to tick. This medical variance marks them as targets in the most brutal social hierarchy on Earth. They are the late bloomers, mocked, ostracized, and convinced they are broken. But what the world writes off as a defect is sometimes just power waiting for its moment to erupt. In medical terms, it's called constitutional delay of puberty. In the hallways of any high school, it's a sentence. Your body becomes a public bulletin board for ridicule, your confidence shredded before it ever forms. This is the story of the ultimate underdog, not on a sports field, but in the unforgiving arena of human development. When every social rule says you've lost before you've begun, what happens next defies every expectation. The countdown to eruption has already started. Meet Alina. At 15, while her classmates transformed, she remained trapped in the body of a child. The whispers started as jokes, then hardened into a permanent label, the defective one. The locker room became a chamber of horrors, a daily referendum on her inadequacy. For Alina and millions like her, puberty isn't a private transition. It's a public spectacle where you are the main attraction and the reviews are brutal. The psychological toll is not anecdotal, it's clinical. Studies show adolescents with delayed development experience anxiety and depression rates significantly higher than their peers. Their brains, wired for social connection during these years, instead internalize a crushing narrative of rejection. This is where the system often fails them. The first port of call is usually a pediatrician. For many, the diagnosis is constitutional delay, a fancy term for wait and see. But in the social thunderdome of adolescence, wait and see is a death sentence. The message is internalized: you are broken, you are late, you are less than. This creates a perfect storm. The child withdraws, becoming less embedded in peer networks. Friendships stall because they lack the shared experiences of budding romance or changing bodies. Intimacy feels impossible when you feel like an alien. The bully's radar pings loudest on difference, and here, the difference is worn on the sleeve every single day. The data is stark. In studies of individuals with profound pubertal delay, 72% of males and 56% of females report having been bullied. This isn't just teasing. This is a sustained campaign that rewires the brain. Research published just last year revealed a devastating chain reaction. Adolescents bullied at age 11, who then developed greater interpersonal distrust by age 14, were 3.5 times more likely to experience significant mental health problems by age 17. The late bloomer isn't just waiting for a growth spurt. They are navigating a neurological minefield, where every sneer and laugh carves a deeper groove of isolation. Into the other key players in this drama, the family. Parental anxiety often mirrors the child's shame. Well-meaning comments, "Don't worry, you'll catch up," feel like dismissals. Siblings developing normally become living yardsticks of failure. The dinner table morphs into an unspoken tribunal. And then there are the institutions. The school, with its hormone-charged ecosystem, operates on a ruthless social Darwinism. Physical education classes are particular theaters of cruelty. Team picks, locker room changes, swimming units, each is a meticulously crafted humiliation. Coaches, focused on performance, often overlook the kids struggling not with skill, but with the sheer terror of exposure. The system's inability to protect them sends a clear message: your pain is not important enough to disrupt the natural order. But what is happening beneath the surface? While Alina's body appears static, a silent, complex biological war is raging. The command center for puberty is a tiny region of the brain called the hypothalamus. It must release a pulse of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which then signals the pituitary gland, which then talks to the ovaries or testes. In constitutional delay, this hypothalamic pulse generator is simply stuck in a prepubertal mode. It's not broken, it's dormant. Genetics load the gun here, accounting for a huge percentage of the timing, but environment can pull the trigger or keep it locked. Excessive athletic training, eating disorders, or chronic illness can all signal the brain that the body is not ready, not safe for the massive energy investment of reproduction. So the brain waits, and while it waits, the social world moves on, leaving the child behind. For most, the wait ends. The pulse generator kicks in, often around age 16 or 17. They experience a rapid catch-up growth, but the scars from the waiting years don't magically fade. The psychological data shows these individuals can carry higher levels of body dissatisfaction into adulthood. For boys, it's often a lingering sense of being under-muscled, less masculine. The trauma of being at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, a very real primal social structure, leaves a lasting imprint. They learn their place in the pack, and that lesson is hard to unlearn. But this is the expected path, the benign delay. What happens, however, when the delay isn't benign, when the clock isn't just slow, but fundamentally wired differently? This is where Alina's story takes a sharp turn from the common narrative. After 2 years of wait and see, her new endocrinologist, Dr. Evans, looked past the standard growth charts. He ordered a specific battery of tests, probing not just for delay, but for absence. The results came back not with reassuringly low numbers, but with a bizarre, contradictory profile. Certain hormones were indeed dormant, as expected. But others, subtle markers few doctors think to check, were present in trace amounts that made no sense for a classic delay. It was as if her system wasn't offline, but stuck in a diagnostic loop, testing a connection that wouldn't fully establish. Dr. Evans called it an incomplete awakening. The medical term, whispered with a note of extreme rarity, was atypical congenital hypogonadotropic hypogonadism. In plain English, a pubertal system that isn't just late, but is built on an entirely different blueprint. 1 in 10,000, maybe 1 in 50,000. The standard protocol for this diagnosis is immediate hormone replacement therapy. Jumpstart the system, force the change. But Dr. Evans, reviewing the odd hormonal whispers in her bloodwork, posed a terrifying, thrilling question. What if we don't? What if this isn't a defect to be corrected, but a different kind of developmental path? The risk was immense. Further social ostracization, potential bone density issues, the certainty of remaining an outsider. But the alternative, the chemical forcing of a process her body seemed to resist, felt like a violation. Alina, for the first time, was given a choice no teenager should have to make: conform to nature's typical schedule or embrace a bewildering, unknown biological mystery. She chose the mystery. She stopped the doctors. She walked out of the clinic and back into the world, looking exactly the same as she had for years. But everything had changed, because now she knew she wasn't just a late bloomer. She was something else entirely, and her body was just beginning to hint at what that might be. The world, however, does not reward mystery. It punishes difference. Alina returned to her final year of high school not as a medical curiosity, but as a confirmed freak. The choice to forgo treatment filtered through the gossip mill, warping into a dark rumor. She had chosen to stay a child. The bullying evolved from casual cruelty to a focused campaign. Notes left in her locker asked if she was waiting for a fairy godmother. In gym class, a boy loudly wondered if her body was preserved in formaldehyde. The social death was absolute, but a subtle internal shift had begun. The first sign wasn't physical, it was sensory. Sounds became sharper. The fluorescent lights in the hallways emitted a faint, high-pitched whine she had never noticed. She could distinguish the scent of rain on concrete from the scent of rain on grass. It was as if her nervous system, deprived of one developmental path, was amplifying others. Her brain was compensating, rewiring in the silence. Dr. Evans, monitoring her remotely, was fascinated. He called it cross-modal neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reallocate resources. But he was also deeply concerned. Without the hormonal surge of puberty, bone density could become an issue. Cardiovascular health could be affected. They walked a tightrope between observing a natural phenomenon and watching a medical time bomb. Alina's parents, who had supported her brave choice, now lived in a state of quiet terror. Every minor illness was a potential catastrophe. Every doctor's visit was an interrogation. The pressure to just take the hormones to be normal was a constant, suffocating presence. Yet Alina held firm. She had felt something in that clinic, not a broken system, but a dormant one, a locked door. And behind it, she was certain, was not emptiness, but a different room entirely. The bridge to adulthood is built on milestones Alina would never have. No driver's license photo marking a transition. No college parties where everyone looks the same age. While her peers moved into dorms and first apartments, Alina lived at home, attending community college online. Her world shrank to the size of her bedroom screen. The psychological studies on this are brutal. This kind of prolonged social isolation during late adolescence correlates with increased risks for chronic depression and anxiety disorders in later life. Elena was living a real-time experiment in delayed development, and the initial results were devastating. She was stuck, a ghost in her own life. But then, at age 21, the second sign appeared. It was physical, but it defied all endocrinology textbooks. She didn't develop curves or facial hair. Instead, her resting body temperature dropped by nearly a full degree. Her metabolism slowed to a crawl. She could eat very little and maintain perfect, unchanging weight. Her need for sleep decreased to just 4 or 5 hours a night. Dr. Evans, receiving this data, was no longer just fascinated. He was alarmed. This wasn't delayed puberty. This was metabolic hibernation. He assembled a team, a neurologist, a geneticist, a specialist in rare metabolic disorders. The tests moved from curious to invasive: full-body MRI scans, muscle biopsies, exhaustive genetic sequencing. The goal was no longer to trigger puberty, but to answer a terrifying question: what was her body conserving all its energy for? The geneticist, Dr. Chen, made the first breakthrough. Buried in Elena's genome were a cluster of single nucleotide polymorphisms, tiny genetic variations associated with extreme environmental adaptation. They were markers often found in populations from historically resource-scarce or high-altitude regions. But in Elena, they were expressed in a unique, potent combination never before documented. One gene in particular, related to hypothalamic function, showed a mutation so rare it didn't have a name. Dr. Chen called it the regulator gene. Its presumed function: to put the entire system into a holding pattern until specific, extreme conditions were met. Puberty wasn't delayed, it was gate-kept. This revelation reframed everything. Elena wasn't defective. She was engineered, by chance, by evolution, for a different kind of survival. Her body wasn't failing to launch. It was waiting for a launch sequence that modern life never provided. The team theorized that in a prehistoric context, such a trait might have been advantageous. In a time of famine or tribal conflict, an individual who could remain prepubescent, non-threatening, requiring fewer resources, until the crisis passed or until they encountered a mate of sufficient genetic quality, would have a survival edge. Her biology was an ancient contingency plan, a living fossil of human adaptation. But in a world of constant plenty and social complexity, it was a curse. The social ostracization she endured wasn't just cruelty. It was a modern world trigger her body might misinterpret as a persistent, low-grade threat, further reinforcing the hold. The institutional stakes skyrocketed. The university hospital's ethics board got involved. Was it ethical to continue observational study on a patient with a potential metabolic disorder? Should they attempt an intervention to force a normal life, even if it meant overwriting this rare genetic blueprint? Elena was no longer just a patient. She was a precedent. Her case was presented at a closed-door endocrinology symposium. The reaction was a schism. One faction saw a woman suffering from a disease that must be cured. The other saw a unique human genotype that must be preserved for science. Elena felt herself dissolving into a debate. Her humanity was being sidelined by her own biology. The pressure to conform, to become a normal 22-year-old, reached a crescendo. Her parents, worn down by years of worry, gently begged her to consider the hormone therapy. Just be normal, sweetheart, please. It was the ultimate betrayal. The people who had stood by her were now asking her to annihilate the very thing that made her her. In despair, she almost agreed. The appointment was scheduled. The synthetic hormones were prepared, but the night before, something primal revolted. She felt a surge of visceral animal denial. It wasn't emotional, it was cellular. She cancelled. This act of final defiance had a cost. Her family, at their wits' end, gave her an ultimatum: either pursue treatment or move out. They could no longer watch her what they saw as self-destruction. At 23, Elena Sterling, with her bizarre metabolism and childlike appearance, was truly alone. She took a small apartment and a data entry job she could do at night, minimizing human contact. She became a ghost in the city. This was rock bottom, but in narrative terms, rock bottom is just the foundation for what comes next. Because the human system, when pushed to its absolute limit, has only two choices: break or transform. The transformation began not with a bang, but with a pull. It was a Friday night. She was walking home from the grocery store, head down, when a wave of dizziness hit her. It was followed by an overwhelming, magnetic sense of direction, not to place, but to person. 2 blocks away, a fight had broken out outside a bar. A man was shouting, aggression pouring off him in almost visible waves. To everyone else, it was a distasteful scene to avoid. To Alina's newly awakened senses, it was a beacon. Her body reacted before her mind could process. Her heart rate didn't spike in fear, it slowed, becoming a deep, powerful drum. A cool, focused clarity descended over her. She didn't feel afraid of the aggression. She felt authoritative. For the first time in her life, the social hierarchy that had terrorized her flipped. She saw the shouting man not as a threat, but as a subordinate. It was an instinct, profound and undeniable. She turned and walked away, but the genie was out of the bottle. The regulator gene hadn't been waiting for hormones. It had been waiting for a challenge, for a true test of dominance. She hid the experience, even from Dr. Evans, but she began to experiment cautiously. She would stand her ground when someone pushed past her in a queue. The usual flinch was gone, replaced by a steady gaze that often made the other person back down. She found she could project a stillness that demanded silence in a noisy room. This wasn't confidence. It was something deeper, something biological. Her body was speaking a language she didn't know she knew. Dr. Evans, reviewing her latest scans, noticed unexplained new neural pathways forming between her amygdala, the fear center, and her prefrontal cortex. Her brain was literally hardwiring a bypass around fear directly to control. The holding pattern was ending. The system was powering up for its true function. The crisis that would trigger the full awakening arrived with a letter. It was a formal notice from her corporate landlord. The building was being sold to a developer, all month-to-month tenants were being evicted. Her safe, isolated bubble was popping. Panic, the old panic of being exposed and powerless, threatened to swallow her, but beneath it, the new circuitry hummed to life. She attended the tenant meeting in the cramped lobby. The developer's representative, a smug man in an expensive suit, talked down to them, offering paltry buyouts. He represented everything that had ever crushed her: institutional power, dismissive arrogance, the tyranny of the normal. As he spoke, Alina felt it, not anger but a rising pressure. It started in her core, a coil of energy winding tighter and tighter. The air in the room seemed to thicken. People began to fidget, then fall silent. The representative stumbled over his words, his confidence faltering. He looked around, confused, his eyes finally landing on Alina. She wasn't shouting, she was just staring. But in that moment, she was no longer a tenant. She was the apex predator in the room. He cut his presentation short, mumbling about reconsidering the offers, and practically fled. The tenants cheered, thanking some collective spirit of resistance. But Alina walked home in a daze. She had done that. She had weaponized her own presence. That night the dam broke. Lying in bed, the coiled energy exploded outwards in a silent, invisible wave. Every dog on her block began to howl simultaneously. The lights on her street flickered and died. In her own body, it felt like a dam breaking, a glacier calving. A surge of power, warm and golden and terrifying, flooded every cell. For 25 years, her body had been a locked vault. Tonight, the door wasn't just opened. It was blown off its hinges. She didn't shift. She erupted. And the wave of pure, undiluted dominance that radiated from her sleeping form reached out 2 blocks in every direction, whispering a single, ancient command to the animal brain of every human it touched: submit. Alina woke at dawn, but the world had not. The silence was the first clue. The usual chorus of morning traffic, barking dogs and slamming doors was absent. She stumbled to her window. The street was littered with cars, some parked at odd angles, others gently nudged against curbs. People were sitting on sidewalks, heads in their hands, or standing in dazed clusters. It looked like the aftermath of a localized earthquake, but there was no damage, only a collective, profound disorientation. Her phone was dead. Every digital clock in her apartment was blinking 12:00. The power was back, but the grid had reset. Her own body felt different, not transformed but integrated. The constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that had been her background music for a decade was gone. In its place was a deep, resonant stillness. She had not just released energy last night. She had become a different kind of conductor. The official explanation, when it came hours later via confused news anchor, was a rare geomagnetic microstorm coupled with a coincidental localized power surge. A freak natural event. But Alina knew, and so it seemed did others. By noon, a black SUV was parked across the street. 2 men in nondescript suits watched her building. They didn't approach. They observed. The first countermove had begun. Dr. Evans called her, his voice a mixture of terror and exhilaration. His lab's equipment, miles away, had registered a massive, anomalous electromagnetic pulse originating from her apartment at exactly 2:17 a.m. The pulse carried a biological signature, a unique pattern of low-frequency waves that matched, at a thousand-fold amplification, the odd neural oscillations he'd seen in her early scans. "Elena," he whispered over the phone, "what did you do?" Before she could answer, the line clicked, then went dead. The watchers weren't just outside. They were in the systems. The institutional machine, slow to recognize her difference, was now operating with terrifying efficiency. By the end of the day, she was served with a mandatory quarantine order from the County Department of Public Health, citing a potential novel environmental pathogen as the cause of the neighborhood's mass fainting spells and electrical disruption. It was a legal fiction, but a powerful one. They couldn't explain her, so they would contain her. The men in the SUV were now at her door with a hazmat team for show. This was the wait, it gets worse moment. Her unique biology, once a medical curiosity, was now a national security concern. She was to be taken to a secure federal medical facility for observation and decontamination. In the back of the SUV, one of the men, who finally showed a badge from an agency with a meaningless acronym, laid it out. "You have a condition. We have a facility. You can come voluntarily and be studied with dignity, or we can take you involuntarily as a public health risk. Your choice." The illusion of choice was the same one she'd faced her whole life: conform or be crushed. She chose the facility, knowing it was a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. The facility was a sterile underground level of a research hospital she'd never heard of. The tests began anew, but their nature had changed. They were no longer diagnostic. They were stress tests. They measured her tolerance for pain, for sleep deprivation, for sensory overload. They exposed her to aggressive individuals in controlled settings and monitored the physiological responses of both parties. They were trying to trigger the event again to measure the weapon. Elena felt the old humiliation return, dressed in the cold cloth of science. She was a specimen, but this time the power inside her didn't recoil. It watched, it learned, and it began to push back in subtle ways. During an EEG scan, when a technician became impatient and jerked her arm, the machine's readout didn't show her brainwaves. It showed the technician, mirrored from 3 feet away, spiking with fear. The researchers were stunned. Her field wasn't just suppressive, it was permeable and interactive. She wasn't emitting a wave, she was broadcasting a state. The major pivot came from an unexpected source, a young geneticist on the research team named Leo. He was the one who processed the deep genome sequence from her biopsy. Late one night, he bypassed security protocols and came to her observation room. On a tablet, he showed her a comparison. Her unique, regulated gene wasn't a random mutation. It was an atavism, a throwback to a genetic sequence that hadn't been dominant in humans for tens of thousands of years. And it wasn't alone. By cross-referencing with obscure anthropological databases, he found fragments of it in DNA recovered from Paleolithic burial sites in the Caucasus Mountains. The archaeological notes described the sites as belonging to shamanic or leadership elites. The theory crystallized. Her trait wasn't a disorder, it was a legacy, a biological kingship mechanism dormant in the gene pool, waiting for the right genetic and environmental conditions to express. She wasn't a patient, she was the heir to a primal hierarchy older than civilization. This changed everything. The institution wasn't just containing a hazard, it was potentially holding a sovereign. Leo, risking his career, gave her a choice. He could help her escape, to hide and understand her nature, or she could stay and be dissected. But escape to where? The system had its eyes everywhere. Then Leo revealed the second, more terrifying layer. The agency that took her was a subcontractor. The real interest came from a private biotech conglomerate. EtherCorp, their public face, was longevity research. Their private aim, according to Leo's hacked memos, was directed new revolution. They didn't want to cure her. They wanted to replicate her, to bottle that dominance signal and sell it as the ultimate non-lethal weapon or the ultimate leadership tool. She was no longer a subject. She was proprietary intellectual property. The stakes escalated from personal freedom to a global power play. Elena agreed to Leo's plan. It was a reckless escape straight out of a thriller. He used his clearance to create a false medical emergency, swapping her with a body double in a biosafety bag during a simulated power outage. For 24 hours, She hid in a service crawlspace, listening to the facility descend into frantic lockdown. Then, using old utility blueprints Leo provided, she navigated through steam tunnels to a drainage exit half a mile away. She emerged into a rainy night, free but more hunted than ever. Leo had arranged a safe house, a remote cabin owned by his estranged uncle. It was there, in the silence of the woods, that she began her real education. With nothing but her own mind and the ancient wiring inside her, she practiced. She learned to dial the pressure up and down, from a gentle nudge of calm to a focused beam of absolute command. She could make a charging bear stop in its tracks. She could make a room of crickets fall silent on cue. The power was not mind control. It was the imposition of a profound, physiological suggestion that she was the most important thing in the environment. It was the essence of charisma, weaponized by biology. But Ether Corp did not give up. They had her genetic code. They had years of her medical data. And they had a fallback plan. If they couldn't have the original, they would make their own. Using advanced gene editing techniques on cultured neural cells, they attempted to activate the regulatory pathway her genome described. The results, which Leo discovered in a later data breach, were catastrophic. The test subjects, animal and human cellular models, didn't develop calm dominance. They developed uncontrollable, aggressive psychosis. The king-making gene, without the precise supporting genome Elena possessed, didn't create a leader. It created a tyrant, a creature of pure paranoid dominance. Ether Corp had inadvertently created a blueprint for a monster, and they were desperate to get Elena back to fix it, to use her as a template to stabilize their experiments. The hunt intensified from recapture to eradication. If they couldn't have her viable, they would harvest her and destroy the evidence. The crisis that forced her public return was triggered by one of these flawed experiments. Ether Corp, in its recklessness, had a containment breach. A test subject, a former soldier turned volunteer named Marcus, undergoing their experimental leadership enhancement, underwent a psychotic break. He escaped their secure lab, armed with both military training and a distorted, aggressive version of Elena's dominance field. His signal was a screech of static compared to her clear tone, but it was powerful. He began to gather a following of disaffected, suggestible individuals, bending them to his will in a small town 60 miles from Elena's hideout. Local law enforcement that tried to intervene became confused, turning on each other. It was a small-scale viral madness. The news called it a mass hysteria event. Elena, watching the reports on a stolen tablet, felt it. A sick, discordant echo of her own power pulsing on the edge of her perception. It was a corruption of what she was, and it was her fault. She knew then that hiding was over. The system that had mocked her, the institution that had imprisoned her, and the corporation that sought to weaponize her had all failed. They had created the problem. Only the original could solve it. She had to face Marcus, not to defeat him with greater force, but to cancel his signal with the true one, to show the difference between a king and a usurper. It was no longer about survival or even freedom. It was about responsibility. She told Leo she was turning herself in, but not to the agency, to the public, to the epicenter of the chaos. He argued, but she was immovable. For the first time, she fully embraced the title her genes had bestowed. She was not Elena Sterling, the defective late bloomer. She was the regulator, and it was time to restore order. She walked into the besieged town of Clearwater as cameras from news helicopters circled overhead. Police barricades had collapsed. People wandered the streets, some following Marcus with fanatical glee, others cowering in shops. Marcus stood on the steps of the town hall, a magnetic, terrifying figure radiating an aura of violent certainty. He saw her the moment she entered the town square. His head snapped toward her. A sneer twisted his face. "The prototype," he boomed, his voice amplified by his distorted field. "Come to be replaced." Elena didn't run, she didn't shout. She simply walked toward him, every step measured. As she walked, she did the opposite of what he did. She didn't push her power out. She pulled the chaotic, frenetic energy of the town into herself, like a sinkhole draining a storm surge. The noise in the square faded. The agitated crowd stilled, their confusion clearing. Marcus's sneer faltered as his audience slipped from his grasp. He roared, focusing his entire twisted field directly at her, a hammer blow of psychic violence meant to shatter her mind. It hit her and it did nothing. It washed over the deep, resonant stillness at her core and dissipated like a wave against a cliff. She was the original, he was the flawed copy. In the presence of the true signal, his static had no power. She stopped 10 feet from him. "You're imitating a language you don't understand," she said, her voice calm but carrying to every ear. "Dominance isn't about making others small. It's about being so sure of your own space, you make everyone else feel safe in theirs." She then did what she was born to do. She released not a wave of force, but a wave of clarity, a resonant frequency of pure, unshakable peace. It was the antithesis of his chaos. Across the town square, people dropped to their knees, not in submission, but in profound relief. Marcus screamed, clutching his head, his artificial field collapsing in on itself. He didn't fall to his knees. He fell unconscious, his system overloading. The silence that followed was not of fear, but of awe. The cameras caught it all, the woman who walked into chaos and silenced it with her presence. The secret was out, irrevocably. The authorities moved in, but they didn't approach her. They secured Marcus, they helped the dazed citizens, but they kept a wide berth around Elena. She stood alone in the center of the square, the eye of a storm she had calmed. She looked up at the circling news helicopters, at the world now watching. She had stopped the immediate threat. But she had also ignited the final global confrontation. Ether Corp had seen their failure. The government had seen a power beyond their control. The public had seen a miracle or a monster. Elena's journey from the humiliated late bloomer to the hidden heir was over. Now began the battle for the throne she never asked for in a world utterly unprepared for a queen. In the days that followed, the world tried to fit Elena Sterling into a box. Was she a mutant, a messiah, a military asset? The Clearwater footage looped on every news channel, analyzed by physicists, psychologists, and conspiracy theorists. The official story fractured. The agency that had held her disavowed knowledge, calling her a private citizen with an unusual medical condition. Ether Corp went dark, scrubbing its website and issuing a statement about terminating an unauthorized research branch. They offered a settlement to the victims in Clearwater, hoping to buy silence. But the genie was out. The public, however, didn't see a biotech scandal. They saw a woman who had walked into chaos and restored peace without lifting a finger. For a society drowning in noise and conflict, she became an instant, potent symbol. The hashtag, The Calm, trended for a week. Elena did not give interviews. She retreated, this time by choice, to a remote location under the protection of a new, unexpected ally, a coalition of academic institutions and ethical science foundations. They formed a council, not to study her as a subject, but to learn from her as a partner. The first order of business was dealing with the fallout. Marcus, the failed experiment, was taken into custody. His condition was tragic. The aggressive gene editing had caused irreversible neuroinflammation. He was not a villain, but a victim. Elena insisted he receive palliative care, not imprisonment. The remaining test subjects from Ether's programs were located and offered medical support to mitigate the side effects. The corporation itself was dismantled by lawsuits and federal investigations, its assets funneled into a trust for its victims and for ethical genetic research. The CEO and lead scientists faced charges of reckless endangerment and fraud. The system that sought to exploit her was now being dismantled by the very precedent she set. But Elena's true work was just beginning. With the council's help, she embarked on a series of controlled, public demonstrations, not of power, but of principle. She visited a maximum security prison, walking through cell blocks and projecting her field of calm. Violence rates in the facility dropped by 90% for a month. She sat in on high-stakes diplomatic negotiations, not as a participant, but as a living mediator. Her presence reduced posturing and cut negotiation times in half. The data was irrefutable. Her ability, which she now called resonant harmonization, had measurable, positive effects on human psychology and social dynamics. It wasn't mind control. It was a biological catalyst for empathy and rational thought. She was a walking, talking peace summit. The scientific community, once skeptical, was revolutionized. Dr. Evans and Dr. Chen published the seminal paper on the Sterling allele, detailing the genetic and neurological basis of her trait. It was peer-reviewed and accepted. The discovery redefined concepts of leadership and social cohesion, framing them not just as psychological constructs, but as potential biological traits that could lie dormant in the human genome. Research grants flooded into studying altruism, cooperation, and nonverbal communication. The old, brutal dominance hierarchies of adolescence were now seen in a new light. not as natural law, but as a primitive state awaiting a more sophisticated form of regulation. Elena's childhood tormentors, seeing her on the world stage, were forced to confront the magnitude of their error. Some reached out with apologies. She accepted them with the same calm detachment, freeing herself from the last chains of that old pain. On a personal level, Elena's life transformed. She reconciled with her parents, their fear replaced by bewildered pride. She used the settlement funds from her lawsuits to establish the Late Bloomer Foundation, providing support and advocacy for adolescents with developmental differences, aiming to prevent the isolation she endured. She became the patron saint of the outsider, but from a position of unassailable strength. Yet she remained an enigma. She never took a title. She refused political office. She lived simply, her needs few, her influence vast. She was not a ruler, but a regulator, a fixed point of stability in a chaotic world. The final surprising detail emerged from a global genetic survey initiated by the Council. The Sterling allele was rare, but not unique. Scattered across the world's population, about 1 in every 200,000 people carried a version of the gene complex. Most would never express it, lacking the precise environmental triggers or the full genetic suite. But some, like Elena, might. The Council began a discreet, ethical outreach program, offering genetic counseling and support to these individuals, helping them understand their potential without exploitation. Humanity, it turned out, had always had the biological hardware for peacekeepers. They had just been waiting in the shadows, often mistaken for broken parts. Elena's journey closed the loop on every injustice. The humiliation she suffered was not a prelude to failure, but the friction necessary to ignite a diamond. The medical establishment that failed her was now reformed by her example. The corporate greed that tried to steal her power was bankrupted by it, and the social hierarchy that once placed her at the bottom now had to invent a new top row with her name on it. She did not conquer with force. She prevailed by becoming so utterly herself that the world had no choice but to realign around her. As she stands today, advising leaders and shaping a new science of human potential, the lesson of her story is clear. True power is not about being first. It's about being inevitable. The late bloomer does not race against others' clocks. They operate on a different schedule entirely, one where the wait is not a delay, but a gathering of strength. And when they finally emerge, they don't just join the world. They change its very frequency. So what does Elena Sterling's story tell us about the very nature of power? For centuries, we've envisioned it as something seized through strength, wealth, or will. But her journey reveals a counterintuitive truth. The most profound power can be something you are, not something you take. It can be dormant, misunderstood, and even ridiculed until the moment the world needs it most. Her tale reframes the very archetype of the underdog. It's not just about overcoming odds. It's about the possibility that the quality which makes you an outcast is the exact calibration the future requires. The late bloomer isn't failing to keep pace. They are waiting for the world to catch up to their tempo. This narrative forces an uncomfortable, essential question. How many other Elenas are living among us right now, not with the same genetic marker, but with other forms of dormant potential? The brilliant mind muted by anxiety, the empathetic heart crushed by cynicism, the innovative spirit shackled by routine. We are a culture that celebrates early achievement and rapid growth, often discarding or demeaning those on a different developmental path. What genius, what peace, what solutions have we lost because we mistook a different clock for a broken one? Elena's legacy is a mandate to look deeper, to question our hierarchies, to consider that the person at the margins might not be at the edge of the circle, but at the center of a different one entirely. The science she inspired is now exploring the frontiers of neuroplasticity and genetic expression, asking if traits like resilience, compassion, and wisdom might have biological triggers we can nurture rather than pharmaceutical ones we can prescribe. It's a shift from fixing people to fostering conditions where their latent potential can emerge. This isn't just about medicine. It's about education, parenting, leadership. It's about building a society that doesn't just tolerate difference, but knows how to listen for its unique frequency. For anyone who has ever felt behind, overlooked, or fundamentally out of step, let this story be your anchor. Your timeline is your own. The pressure to conform is the noise of a world afraid of silence. The waiting is not emptiness, it is the gathering. And the eruption, when it comes, is not an act of vengeance, but an offering of a gift the world didn't know it was missing. If this exploration of hidden potential and stunning reversal resonated with you, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, it truly helps the channel. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their time is coming. And subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell, because we dive deep into the stories of underdogs, mysteries, and the science of the extraordinary every single week. Let me know in the comments below, where in your own life have you seen a late bloomer defy every expectation? I read every single one. Until next time, remember, the most powerful forces are often the quietest, right up until the moment they change everything.